Hey everybody, I was recently made aware that James White over at Alpha and Omega Ministries spent a few minutes talking about me and my position on the absence of monotheism in the Bible. And I thought I would address James' argument just to show you how little James is actually aware of contemporary scholarship and how much he relies entirely on his own presuppositions and his dogmas to try to perform academic competence, and not very well. Let's take a look.
So he linked me to this video. And good old Dan McClellan. Now, Dan McClellan, here's how Dan McClellan works. And I don't know exactly where he is and everything. I saw I think we responded on this program to some wacky stuff he said about the New Testament and homosexuality.
So I'm not really sure exactly what he's talking about here. I don't recall if I've seen any such video. I don't recall if I've responded to any such video. I don't think I have. But anything that I've said on social media about homosexuality in the New Testament is going to be a position that is part of mainstream scholarship, that is a representative, if not majority, view. So the notion that anything I've said about homosexuality in the New Testament on social media is wacky is just the position of someone who thinks that mainstream scholarship itself is wacky.
He's one of these guys, honestly, that thinks he's the only one that really gets it. And look, when N.T. Wright does that, when that Eastern Orthodox guy does that, at least they've written massive tomes with 47 billion footnotes and stuff like that. And at least they can point to something. This guy can't point to almost anything like that.
So I don't really feel the need to write massive tomes. That's not really necessary within critical scholarship to get your point across. That's more of a theologian thing. But when it comes to monotheism, I have published on this. In fact, I wrote the entry on monotheism for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion. 2 years ago, I organized a conference at Brown University on the absence of monotheism from the Bible and brought together some of the leading scholars of early Judaism and early Christianity. And that volume is going to come out later this year that I have a paper in. I've got other papers in other edited volumes coming out that are going to touch on monotheism. So this is something I have published peer-reviewed scholarship on, and James White has clearly not read or isn't even aware of. So James is going to try to paint me as somebody who just says, well, I'm a scholar, you have to listen to me, and then shares just off-the-wall theories that have no relationship to the discourse that's going on in the scholarship. And that's just not true. What I'm sharing regarding monotheism is something that has been shared many times in the past and something that is a growing position within contemporary critical scholarship. And the main thesis of my video response here is that James White has no clue what's actually going on in the scholarship. And this is something that I pointed out 15 years ago when I first responded to his response to me regarding the notion that Mormons are not Christians. And then he went off on this documentary hypothesis thing, and he's actually going to bring that up in this video. But as I pointed out in my responses to him on my blog 15 years ago, his awareness of the documentary hypothesis is decades out of date because he's just relying on his training from when he got a fake PhD from a diploma mill. He's not at all aware of contemporary scholarship. He does not keep up to date with contemporary scholarship. He just seems to assume that he can passively remain aware of where the scholarship stands and what is good and bad scholarship. And so, as we're going to see in this video, James is entirely going to miss the point and is entirely going to fumble the scholarship regarding monotheism in the Bible.
What he does is he sits down and he says, I'm a Bible scholar, believe me. And then he just throws out all sorts of disjointed, wacky, crazy stuff. And it's just like, Believe me, because I'm a Bible scholar. And most of us who've been teaching longer than he's been alive, don't just roll over and go, yes, sir, okay. But a lot of other people do, unfortunately.
So 2 things here. One, James White doesn't begin to have the first clue what he's talking about when it comes to contemporary academic discourse on things like monotheism. He is not aware of what's going on right now in critical scholarship. He does not care to be aware of what's going on right now in critical scholarship. It would take an awful lot of time and an awful lot of effort to get up to speed, and it would also undermine most of his rhetorical goals, which is why he is content to just carry on with the same sophomoric caricature of critical scholarship that he received when he was being trained many years ago. And that sophomoric caricature was based on critical scholarship from even decades before that, because outdated scholarship is kind of what you have to do to maintain the kind of rhetorical goals that James White is after. So he's not going to get up to speed with critical scholarship. He doesn't have to, because his audience is not up to speed with critical scholarship, doesn't know any better, and also is not interested in getting up to speed with critical scholarship. And this brings up the second thing. This is why, for James White, someone who is representing critical scholarship sounds like somebody just spouting wackadoo off-the-wall nonsense and then retreating to appeals to authority so that people will believe me, when really nothing I say is something that you would not hear in a competent introduction to biblical studies class at the university level. And there are many people across social media who have pointed that out, sometimes as a criticism, sometimes saying, well, Dan's not saying anything you can't get in an intro to biblical studies class, so why do we have this channel? Well, the channel is precisely to try to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion. And so to the best of my ability, I'm sharing the consensus views as I understand them. Now, there are a handful of topics on which I have published my own peer-reviewed research, so I'm sharing my own position, which may or may not align with the consensus view. But on those issues, my scholarship and the full academic arguments are out there and are available. And so if there's something that I'm saying that sounds wackadoo and off the wall and like it doesn't make much sense, one, it is something that has circulation within critical scholarship. And 2, you can go engage my scholarship. I have made publicly available all of the publications of mine that I am legally allowed to make publicly available. You can go through my bio to find access to everything I've ever published, except for 1, my recent trade book, The Bible Says So, and 2, my entry from the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion on monotheism. I don't know what kind of moratorium they have on that, but I will share that as soon as I am legally able to. And anybody who has taken a look at my scholarship and compared it with the current state of critical scholarship has agreed, yeah, this is pretty much in line with where things are right now. So, again, James White doesn't have the foggiest idea what he's talking about.
And so he has this video. He's wearing a Venom shirt. That's great. That always raises things. But he says there's no monotheism in the Bible. Now, just so that you are up to speed, I remember years ago when Richard Mouw.
Okay, so here James goes on about a 10-minute tangent about completely irrelevant stuff. So I'm going to fast forward to where he actually comes back to my video on monotheism.
But let's listen to this. There's no monotheism. Let's listen to this first part and then respond to it.
There is no monotheism in the Bible. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan, a scholar of the Bible and religion, increasing public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion and combating the spread of misinformation about the same. Now, there are 2 points to make here. The first is that the Bible acknowledges the existence of other gods from beginning to end. They are repeatedly recognized as deities in the Hebrew Bible, in Greco-Roman period Jewish literature, in the New Testament, in early Christian literature. Now, sometimes those recognitions occur alongside pieces of rhetoric that say things like, I am and there is no other. There is none like me. This is the rhetoric of incomparability, and we find this in ancient Egyptian literature, in ancient Mesopotamian literature. We find it in a number of different places, and it is not a philosophical rejection of the existence of other gods. It is a rhetorical denigration of them, similar to how I, as a Broncos fan in 1998, would quip that the Raiders are not a real football team. It is not a philosophical rejection of their existence. It is just rhetoric, and that's
Okay. It's just rhetoric. It's just rhetoric. It's like being a Broncos fan and saying that the Raiders aren't a real football team. It's just rhetoric. They're actually acknowledging these other gods exist, but they're denigrating. Does that sound familiar?
I'll spare you another brief tangent where James goes off on Mormonism because he imagines that this has something to do with my position on monotheism in the Bible, which it does not for anyone who actually bothers to understand my position.
But this is the idea. When you read "There is no God besides me" in Scripture, you can go ahead and take it down. We're done. When you read "There is no God aside from me," it's just rhetorical. That was a common claim in Mesopotamian religion. It was it really isn't a philosophical claim. Okay, it's like, if you're a Broncos fan, then the Raiders aren't a real football team. That's what you have here. Let's sort of, think about that for a second and maybe compare that to, not just have a guy sitting there in a Venom shirt saying, "Trust me, I'm the scholar."
So that's not what I've been doing. In addition to pointing to my own work that I have published on this and other videos where I go into more details about the argument itself, I've also pointed to a number of other scholars and scholarship that has been published on this for more than 30 years now, talking about how there's just no monotheism in the Bible. And I think for the best discussion, at least regarding the "there is no God beside me" rhetoric that we find in Deuteronomy and in Deutero-Isaiah, Nathan MacDonald's book, Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism, is wonderful and goes into great detail about why, when we look closely and carefully at that language, it is not talking about the non-existence of other gods. And James doesn't seem to be aware that scholarship exists, is certainly not going to competently engage it.
I know all. I have a degree. Yeah, yay. Not impressed. Not impressed. Well, you do the same thing. No. The difference is I go to the text and let the text speak.
Yeah, that's not what you do, and for multiple reasons, but the main one is because texts don't speak. They can't speak. They're just texts. And as we're going to see, what you actually do is bring a whole suite of dogmas and presuppositions to the text, read the text, and then declare what it's saying, not based on any sound hermeneutics or exegetical principles, but just on what you need the text to be saying. And you can't competently engage any concerns with your exegesis. You just count on your audience agreeing with the meaning that you have declared. That's really all you do. And again, we're going to see that in action in just a moment.
I don't say it's because I'm somebody special. Because what the text says, it said long before I was born, will say the same thing long after I'm gone, and I'm irrelevant to it. Okay? So I have a very different view of where I'm coming from than Dan McClellan clearly has of himself. But let's look at a text here. I may have a hard time getting back to the other stuff. When I get into the text here, it tends to take up a lot of the time, but that's okay. Jeremiah chapter 10. Jeremiah chapter 10. And look, I'm not just pulling this out of the hat. I have a whole discussion on this in Is the More My Brother, which was published in the 90s, been out there for a long time. Hear the word which Yahweh speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says Yahweh, do not learn the way of the nations, do not be terrified by the signs of the heavens. although the nations are terrified by them. That would be astrology, by the way. For the statutes of the peoples are vanity, because it is wood cut from the forest, the works of the hands of a craftsman with a cutting tool. So he's talking, where is Israel right now? Israel's in captivity. And the Babylonians are making claims to them about their gods. Hey, our gods defeated your gods, so why don't you listen to us? For the statutes of the peoples are vanity, because it is wood cut from the forest, the work of the hands of a craftsman with a cutting tool. They make it beautiful with silver and with gold. They strengthen it with nails and with hammers, so it will not totter. Like a scarecrow in a cucumber field are they, and they cannot speak. They must be carried because they cannot take a step. Do not fear them. They can do no harm, nor can they do any good. Does it sound like Jeremiah is going, oh, yeah, there are other gods. This is just a rhetorical denigration of them, but they're real gods. No, they're idols. They cannot speak. They must be carried because they cannot take a step. You think this is a rhetorical statement that, well, but for Israel, we only have the one God. Yeah, for Israel, we only have the one God. That's true. But why? Because the gods of the peoples are idols. Psalm 96:5.
So this is a good example of what I'm talking about, where James is just declaring what the texts mean without acknowledging, much less actually engaging at all, much less competently, where the critical scholarship stands on this. Because when we talk about the idols of the nations and the gods of the nations, there's certainly an awful lot of overlap there. The idols are the material media that presents or manifests the presence of the gods. Now, the nations treated the idols and the gods as certainly overlapping, but not as coterminous or coextensive. The gods had existence apart from the idols. The gods were not enclosed entirely within and limited to the idols. And this is actually something that even Paul, as late as the New Testament, acknowledges, because he talks about how an idol is nothing in the world, and he denigrates the idols and says they are nothing, but also acknowledges that when people make offerings to idols, it's not to the idols that they're making the offering, it's actually to the deity that is being indexed by the idol, which has existence apart from the idol. So, in Psalm 96:5, when it says all the gods of the peoples are Elilim, it's not saying when they talk about their gods, they're just talking about these idols and nothing else. And the idol is the God, and the God does not exist apart from the idol. That's not what Jeremiah nor Psalm 96:5 is actually talking about, because Elilim doesn't actually mean idol. Elilim is supposed to sound like Elohim, but means something more like worthless thing. Or there's even scholarship that has argued that it is based on the divine name Enlil, where the Nun has assimilated to the Lamed because of that consonant cluster. And so Elil becomes Elilim in the plural. And so it's a reference to foreign deities as useless things. And so a more precise way to translate it would be the gods of the peoples are useless things, which doesn't mean they're not gods. And as we're going to see in Jeremiah, Jeremiah doesn't actually believe that the gods of the nations don't exist as gods. Jeremiah is capable of distinguishing the idols from the deities that they index. James is not, because that's not rhetorically useful, because that undermines, that complicates James's position. But the reality is that Deutero-Isaiah and Jeremiah and all the others, down to Paul and even some early Christians after him, recognize that while the idols are inanimate objects that cannot move or speak or taste or smell, they're really just indices. They're really just material media meant to manifest the presence of actual divine beings that have actual existence elsewhere. And again, Paul explicitly acknowledges that. He dismisses them as demons, but he acknowledges that the idols are just material media that index the divine being. Jeremiah believes the same, and we're actually going to see in this passage that James brings up that that is true.
They're idols. They don't have real existence. Well, but then the Greco-Roman period. Oh, you're talking about the intertestamental stuff, about the unseen realm stuff that Heiser was all big into and all that. Is that what you're talking about? Probably. I'd assume so.
No. I disagree with Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm. If you want to understand where I'm coming from, you can check out my open access academic monograph, Adonai's Divine Images, A Cognitive Approach, which is freely accessible online.
But his stuff never stood up to examination against the entire canon of Scripture either.
So this is just the presupposition of univocality, the notion that academic work has to fit within the entire canon of Scripture. That's not critical scholarship. That's just dogmatism. That's the presupposition of univocality. And it requires that one agree with James's position on what the entire canon of Scripture is saying, which, again, requires that one just agree with James's arbitrary declarations of what the texts mean.
That's the problem. I mean, it sounds really cool, and we can really make ourselves look neat. I almost never have to take drinks, but I mentioned this during the conference. I was drinking a lot. Have you seen the dew point recently? It's like below zero. It is so dry right now that it is, I mean, what?
I just want to warn your critics. I think it's not fair game to use that as a clip. I was drinking a lot.
It doesn't matter. They'll use it anyways. Because they don't care what the dew point in Phoenix is. Look, most people just don't realize how dry March is. I mean, you can desiccate anything. Just leave it outdoors. It'll be gone. Because they don't care what the dew point in Phoenix is. So they have all been made by man. They come forth from the creation. But Yahweh is the true God. Elohim Emeth. The true God. Okay. So if Yahweh, Jeremiah 10:10, right here, right there. Yahweh Elohim Emeth. Now, this also, by the way, helps you to see the foolishness of Joseph Smith.
So, another irrelevant tangent about Mormonism that I'm going to skip over.
He is the true God. Not the true gods. He is the living God. Okay. What's the opposite of true? False. What's the opposite of living? Dead. So what are these other gods? But it's just a rhetorical point about the Broncos. No. There is a necessary meaning here if you're going to allow the text to have any meaning at all.
Well, the text doesn't have any meaning at all. We're not excavating meaning. We're not unboxing meaning. We're not discovering meaning. We're creating meaning with the text. Any attempt to assert this is what the text means is a reconstruction of meaning that we engage in coordination and negotiation with the text. And the goal is to try to reconstruct a meaning that we believe is most likely what was intended by the authors and understood by the audiences, at least from a historical critical point of view. And so everybody who reads the text is constructing their own meaning. And as I've pointed out many times on my channel, really the question is, where on this spectrum are we falling? Are we trying to reconstruct a meaning that makes the text most meaningful and useful to us? Or are we on the other end of the spectrum trying to reconstruct a meaning that we believe would have made the text most meaningful and useful to the authors and the original audiences? I'm on this end of the spectrum. James is on this end of the spectrum because all the readings that he endorses ultimately serve his own identity politics as a conservative Christian, even over and against other conservative Christians. But when we look at this text, we see some interesting things here that are not easily accounted for in James's reading. Why is Adonai consistently and repeatedly throughout the entire book of Jeremiah referred to as the God of Israel or our God? If Adonai is the only God that exists, why must Jeremiah overwhelmingly qualify the noun Elohim with some kind of pronominal suffix? Why is it always God as the God of Israel, as our God, and the other gods as their gods? What that's presupposing is a conceptualization of deity as a category with a lot of members, of which Adonai is one, and the one that pertains to the nation of Israel. And this is something that we find in all the pre-exilic literature as well, where Adonai is not accessible outside the land of Israel normally. Adonai is not worshipped outside of the land of Israel. For instance, when Naaman comes to Israel to be healed, at the end he says he wants to worship Adonai when he's back in Syria, but Adonai is in the land of Israel. How can he facilitate worship of the God who can only be worshipped on Israelite soil? Well, he takes 2 cartloads of Israelite soil with him. And people will say, well, wait a minute. Naaman says, for now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Doesn't that mean that Adonai is the only God? No. Again, it's rhetoric, and also Naaman's statement quite clearly indicates that the God of Israel is only God on Israelite soil. That agrees with the taking 2 cartloads of Israelite soil back to Syria. If Adonai was the only God in all the earth, full stop, then there would be no need to bring 2 cartloads of Israelite soil back to Syria. There would also be no need to add the last part of the statement. There is no God in all the earth except in Israel. There is no God in all the other nations of the earth. The God is located in Israel. That's the worldview that Jeremiah is inheriting and negotiating with, because there are going to be incremental elaborations on the conventional wisdom that gets passed down from generation to generation. And so what is Jeremiah's innovation? Well, the wagging of the finger at the gods of the nations and saying they are no gods, lo Elohim, a couple of times in Jeremiah, isn't really that much of an innovation. We already see that in Deuteronomy 32, where God says that the gods of the nations are lo El, but God is going to basically torment the people of Israel with a nation that is lo Am, not a people. And so the lo El, the not God rhetoric, is rhetorically parallel to the lo Am, not a people rhetoric. And who is that not a people? Well, it's either the Babylonian or the Assyrian Empire, an enormous empire that was much larger than the nation of Israel. You see how the rhetoric is functioning by calling the gigantic empire next door a no people? It's the same as calling the gods of the nations lo El, a no God. And this is also what Jeremiah is doing. If you pay close attention to the rhetoric, you'll see that when Jeremiah is wanting to refer to the gods as just idols, there are specific ways that Jeremiah does that. On occasion, Jeremiah actually refers to the other gods as other gods, but dismisses them as irrelevant, or, as we're going to see in verse 11, as doomed to destruction.
He is the living God and the Melech Olam, everlasting king. At his wrath the earth quakes and the nations cannot endure his indignation. Then something fascinating happens here. And I know we've gone over this before, but we always have new listeners, thankfully. This verse right here is not in Hebrew. It looks like it is. Well, yes, it's definitely a Semitic tongue. But it's in Aramaic.
Well, I'm much more interested in the fact that this verse acknowledges the other gods. And the contrast now between the gods of the nations and Adonai is the fact that the gods of the nations were not the gods that created the heavens and the earth. And this is rhetoric we find much more commonly where the God of Israel is incomparable. The God of Israel is so much greater than the other gods because the God of Israel was the one who created the heavens and the earth, and the other gods did not create the heavens and the earth. So this is a different type of rhetoric From the normal, they can't speak, they can't talk, they're just objects of wood and stone, the work of human hands. That's anti-idol polemic. And like I said earlier, there is certainly overlap between the conceptualization of the gods of the nations and anti-idol polemic. But there's also distinction. And this is where the rhetoric slips into acknowledging the gods of the nations and treating them as gods. And we see this here in Jeremiah, where the contrast is not between actually existing and not existing. The contrast is which one's more powerful, which one created the heavens and the earth. And then the notion that they will perish from the earth and from under the heavens, this is kind of a meaningless thing to apply to the idols, because we've already denigrated them as works of wood and stone that can't move and that have to be secured in place so they don't topple over. They're utterly powerless. What does it matter if they perish or not? This is more like a judgment against the gods of the nations, qua gods. This is what happens in the book of Exodus, where Adonai says, I am going to pass judgment on the gods of Egypt. And when Moses goes before the Pharaoh to demonstrate the power of Adonai, the God of Israel, the Pharaoh's magicians are able to almost match what Moses is able to do. So there is power that these gods are able to manifest. Now, the book of Exodus treats Adonai's power as superior to that of the gods of Egypt. And that is how Adonai can pass judgment on the gods of Egypt. But Exodus is very clearly treating the gods of Egypt as actual divine powers that actually exist, but are no match for Adonai. And that's what we have in a number of places. And even in Deuteronomy and in Deutero-Isaiah, where we have this, there's no other God beside me, you have in close proximity references in a variety of ways to other gods. For instance, in Deuteronomy 32:39, you have this I am he, there is no God beside me rhetoric. And a couple verses later, you have worship him all you gods, which is not in the Masoretic text, but has been restored thanks to what we have in the Septuagint, what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that is quoted in Psalm 97:7. So even as you are denigrating rhetorically the gods of the nations and treating them as nothing and as less than nothing, which Deutero-Isaiah also applies to Babylon and Assyria, even as you have this rhetoric that says, there's no God beside me, you frequently have references to other gods. Worship him, all you gods. God is God of gods. What use is this rhetoric to say, God is the God over all these non-existent nothings? That's not useful rhetoric. The more powerful those gods are, the more useful the rhetoric. So the fact that these are the gods of this gigantic empire next door, to say that Adonai dwarfs them is rhetorically meaningful, just like it's rhetorically meaningful for Adonai to say, I'm going to take this no people that is this gigantic empire next to you, and I'm going to use them to humiliate you. This is rhetoric. When you try to allow these texts to operate on their own terms, in their own context and circumstances, you can see the rhetorical purposes bubbling to the surface. You can understand how Jeremiah can operate within a worldview that acknowledges the existence of other gods. And you can see how it is meaningful to say, they're just the works of human hands. They are powerless. They are useless things. They are Elohim. You can see how this all works, but if you require that the text be denying the existence of other gods, even within this worldview that is clearly inheriting the perception that the world is full of other gods, then you have to overlook how the text is functioning. You have to overlook all of the context. You have to just insist that it be read according to these anachronistic interpretive lenses that you're imposing on the text, which require this thing that even if you conclude that Jeremiah does deny the existence of the other gods, they're acknowledged in several other earlier books in the Hebrew Bible, and they get acknowledged in the later books of the Hebrew Bible, and they get acknowledged in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they get acknowledged in early Jewish literature, and they get acknowledged in the New Testament. Like I said earlier, Even Paul, who denigrates the idols as useless, as nothing in the world, acknowledges that the idols are not coterminous and coextensive with the deities, the divine beings that they are understood to index. Even Paul acknowledges that the idols are just indexing these divine beings that are elsewhere. And Paul denigrates them as demons based on the ancient Greek translation of Deuteronomy 32:17, which says that they are lo Eloah, which just means not God. And then the next clause goes on to call them gods that they did not know. So the Shedim, which gets translated as demons in the Septuagint, and that's how Paul represents them, appositionally identifies them as gods that they did not know. And guess what Jeremiah frequently refers to the gods of the nations as? Gods that Israel did not know. So when you allow the text to operate on its own terms and in its own context, including the broader literary context, you can see the rhetorical purposes bubbling to the surface, which clearly recognize the existence of other gods, but are rhetorically denigrating them to make Israel feel better about itself and also to disincentivize seeking after those other gods in order to try to arrogate their power, their influence, their help. It's a way to say you cannot get help from the other gods. You can only get help from Adonai. The other gods are useless. Look at those idols. They have to nail them down just so they don't fall over, whereas Adonai created the heavens and the earth. Adonai is so much better than the gods of the other nations.
And you'll notice there is a note. Yeah. It popped up in the upper right-hand corner there. This verse is in Aramaic. That's in the LSB. Thus you shall say to them, the gods that did not make the heavens and the earth will perish from the earth and from under the heavens. Why would it switch languages? Well, because what language are the Babylonians speaking to the Jews? Aramaic. And so in the language that they are to use and give their apologetic response, as the people of Israel are being tempted to go after these other gods, now that they have been subjugated, judgment has come upon them, God gives to his people, in the language they need to respond to the people inviting them to idolatry, he gives the very words that they are to say. In the language they're to say it. And what are they to say? The gods that did not make the heavens and the earth will perish from the earth and from under the heavens. Every single god Dan McClellan is talking about, where there's no monotheism, is described in Jeremiah 10:11. Every single one. They all derived from the creation. They were not the ex nihilo creator. He goes into that later on. He's big and, oh, no, ex nihilo. Oh, no, no, no. So wise. So brilliant. How come the people of Israel were given an answer that assumes that God is the creator of all things? Not the organizer, not moving pre-existing matter around. The gods that did not make the heavens and the earth will perish from the earth and from under the heavens. If your God did not create the heavens and the earth, it's not God.
So this is an irrelevant statement, because to say in English, if your God didn't do X, it's not God, doesn't mean it's not a God, doesn't mean it's not divine. It just means it's not the God, capital G, the God of Israel, namely Adonai. And to say that your God is not Adonai is not to deny divinity to that other God. It's not to deny that that God exists. It's just to deny the equation of that God with a specific God, which has relevance if and only if you presuppose that Adonai, the God of Israel, exhausts the category of deity, which is not an academic approach. That is a purely dogmatic approach, because in this time and place, no such concept existed.
And it'll perish away. That's the exact apologetic given by God to his people in the language of the people who were inviting them to idolatry.
And that is an acknowledgement that the other gods exist, and is not in any way a denial that the other gods exist.
It is he who made the earth by his power. Note, as throughout Isaiah, the claim of monotheism walks hand in hand with the claim of creatorship.
No, the claim of creatorship walks hand in hand with the rhetoric of incomparability. It's the assertion of a dominant status that allows the people of Israel to say, well, our God accomplished this thing, so you are less than, and your gods are less than. And the same kind of rhetoric is found in other ancient West Asian literature.
You cannot separate the two. Read The Trial of the False Gods. Watch Dan McClellan saying, there's no monotheism in the Bible, and then you go read Isaiah 40 through chapter 48. Just sit there, read it for yourself, and go, your much learning hath made thee mad, Dan.
And as I have pointed out in multiple of the publications of mine that address this question, there are many scholars who have arrived before me at the conclusion that Deutero-Isaiah does not have any monotheism in it, that Deutero-Isaiah does acknowledge the existence of other gods, and that Deutero-Isaiah is, as I have been arguing, using rhetoric to deny the effectiveness, the power, the significance of the other gods, not their existence.
Because it has. It is he who made the earth by his power, who established the world by his wisdom, and by his understanding he has stretched out the heavens. That sounds like creation of all things by God, by power, wisdom, and understanding. Not by the use of pre-existing materials, huh? Nowhere to be found.
Nothing in the text indicates that this creation took place without the use of pre-existing materials. That is something that you must bring to the text, which is why what James is saying here is, gee, that sounds like. Yeah, that's because it sounds like the kind of rhetoric that you read in church, where you talk about creation out of nothing. You've already imposed that interpretive lens on the text. I don't know why you think it is surprising or some kind of insight to say, well, I found in the text precisely what I brought to the text and demanded it give me. That's just dogmatism. And it's unthinking, blithe, oblivious dogmatism, because you actually imagine that you're just letting the text speak for itself, rather than bringing these interpretive lenses to the text and saying, what's going on, Dan? Why would this text mean exactly what I have lived my entire life dogmatically believing that it means, even though it doesn't actually contain in the text anything that would indicate that? That is just laughable.
It's right there. So you got Dan McClellan. There's no monotheism in the Bible. You've got the Bible. It's right here.
Yeah, no, it's not. You can't point to any word or combination of words in that verse that plausibly refers to creation out of nothing, much less must refer to creation out of nothing. The best you can do is say, well, Dan, nothing in this verse stops me from reading creation out of nothing into it. That's the best you can do, which is not letting the text speak for itself, which is certainly not allowing the text to operate on its own terms. That's just reading your dogmas into the text and saying the text didn't stop me. And if that's the standard, you can read almost anything you want into these texts.
Your much learning hath made thee mad.
So, as you can see, there's no serious engagement with my concerns. There's just flippant dismissal and mockery and using accents to make it sound like I'm some kind of hillbilly who doesn't know what I'm talking about, when the reality is that James is completely unaware of literally decades of scholarly discussion on this. James is completely unaware that I have been engaging in that discourse in the critical scholarship. James is completely unaware of all of that stuff. James just comes in and hurls some rhetoric my direction, and then pulls up a passage and says, see this means monotheism, and that proves that it's monotheism and that Dan is a doofus. And James is not going to go and actually read any of the scholarship that I have published on this. James is certainly not going to go do any other research, go through the bibliographies that I provide and see what other scholars are saying about this, both scholars who agree with me and who disagree with me. James has no reason to do any of that. That would be detrimental to the rhetorical goals of James's channel, because it would just muddy the waters for his audience. And the point of his channel is to perform confidence, conviction, and academic competence for an audience that just wants to be made to feel better about their particular religious dogmas. They don't know the scholarship. They're not thinking critical, so they don't need to be given an actual legitimate argument. They just need to see a performance of confidence, conviction, and academic competence on the part of somebody they imagine to have all those things, so that they can put to bed the cognitive dissonance for a little while longer. So James doesn't really know what he's talking about. James hasn't really dipped his toe in academic waters for a very, very long time, because he has found that he does not have to in order to pray on the street corner in a way that gets him the reward that he is looking for. And the fit for this video, it's been the Amazing Spider-Man.